G'day, folks. This is Yisrael Segall. This is Thinking Aloud. On this episode, we're going to kind of go back to, again, this is an introspection, a video journal, kind of me going back through my journey as to where I got to the point where I built MediaSync, or the process of building MediaSync, or what it will become. So I want to kind of start at the beginning because I think the beginning of my journey helped shape of why I did things and led me to kind of where I am today. And that journey kind of starts about 10 years ago. Around 10, 11 years ago, I was a marketing director for a telecommunications company. And, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the entire framework of how everybody did things and what everybody had access to was very, very different to what it is today. We have technology for everything. And back then, we didn't have technology for a lot of it. We had some, but a lot of it was still very, very new. And the company that I worked at, they didn't have any systems, and most of their data that they had, let's say their customer data was all saved in their own custom Microsoft SQL sort of databases. So you had things that were on Google Analytics, which led to the conversion, and then you had anything outside of that was basically past the purchase was on Google Analytics. It was in their CRM, but their CRM was kind of messy. You couldn't really understand, LTV. You couldn't kind of easily group people together or customers together. Customers weren't so easily you couldn't really get a full picture of what happened after that purchase. You couldn't connect it to the pre-purchase. You couldn't really understand what people purchased and what size. You couldn't really understand like the post-purchase kind of dynamic of what they did and kind of what led there. So you couldn't really understand, from the first interaction to the last interaction, there was no understanding of what was going on. The sort of the timeline. Now, I come from a background of both marketing and of psychology. And I was fascinated to understand when I built my strategy even 10, 11 years ago, it was all about understanding how they purchase. Now, so my first thing was to understand what they purchase and why they purchase it, and then how they purchase it. Because I need to create a campaign, that would increase the amount of sales, as we do. But I couldn't have access to the data before. My predecessors, they had to go to the web developer or the developer to get an SQL snippet that would the guy would actually export a table, and that table would give them the data, and that table was static. Anytime they wanted to update it, it was another request. So there was a few things I had to do. First of all, I had to learn SQL, right? I was not satisfied with only having access to the data piecemeal. I wanted to be able to mash the data, get it live, things like that as it happened. I wanted to be able to group things together. So I taught myself SQL. I learned how the table system works, the database system works, how they interplay with each other, and how to group things around to understand the customer, what they actually purchased, to understand in what capacity they purchased, and from where they purchased from. And that gave me an insight into customer behavior and then linking it to the actual product itself. And I had that access pretty much live, which hadn't happened before. And then I was able to take that data and connect it directly to what was then Data Studio. Now it's called Looker Studio. So I could actually get dashboards and mash the data the way they wanted to understand it. Eventually, I would implement Active Campaign, and there would be a system where, like a kind of an API system that would actually go directly and send each new interaction directly into Active Campaign, and then that would be their CRM, and it would track activity, and you get a bit more information. But part of my question was, well, how do I know what channel to work on and which channels contribute most to sales? And I'm not talking about huge attribution things and multi-step journeys. That was still very, very new then, but I just wanted to understand how they purchased. And so I looked at what they purchased and built up a bunch of personas based on that. I looked at the high customers with the highest LTVs, and I was able for some of them to track them back to Google Analytics, and I looked at multi-channel reports in Google Analytics, and that was essentially the extent what I could do back then with the technology that was there. And then every now and then I spoke to people and I sort of got a better understanding, like when people would come in, or I would have, like, we would run campaigns. Uh, we would run campaigns. I would say, tell us one thing you liked about this, and or why you purchased this, and would give you extra data on your SIM card, things like that. And we were able to get decently qualitative information and testimonials about why people actually enjoyed the product, and we turned that into campaigns. Now, okay. So I was able to get some of the data, and I was able to get some of the conversion. It was all very one-dimensional for the most part. So I wanted to look at which campaigns have the biggest impact on on purchases. And because the only system I had that could deal with different layers with Google Analytics, I used Google Analytics for multi-channel or contribution value as a source of truth. And then obviously we used the value based on the actual purchase behavior that we had. And I built this Excel, I built this Excel table that then turned into Data Studio that essentially showed a primitive attribution. It basically showed what was contributing and whether or not it was kind of first, last, or somewhere in the middle. And it showed essentially which channels we should focus on and where. Especially with paid. I did it mostly with paid, and it was about where we should put a lot of the money. And I showed this to a bunch of people, and they really liked it. They said they had a more primitive version of it, and but they liked it, and they copied it. And I figured, you know what? Why don't I build it into a tool? And so I thought about it, and I went to a bunch of people, and they all said no, because they were afraid that it wouldn't work. Even though, and it's true, it may not have worked. There are a lot of companies that have a lot of investment, that require a lot of investment to get their tools working, but it's possible that it wouldn't have worked. And they were right to be afraid. I was the first time. I was kind of fresh. I even went to a developer company to see how much it would cost to produce. They weren't really sure because they hadn't really built anything like that before. I even went to a cousin who was a developer, and I tried to build something like this, and it just didn't work. And why is this important? Because this was the first time where this is one of the first times, and one of the most memorable times, where I had an idea that I desperately and passionately wanted to develop. Right? I love the idea of solving a problem, of helping people do things, either not just more efficiently, but to change the way that people do things to get more out of things, so that 2 + 2 does not equal 4, it equals 15, right? And to sort of shift the way, and even the companies most of the companies that I've worked with since then have sort of done something like that, where it's not just been like we do something a little differently. We actually change something about what's going on. And I wanted to do this, and I wanted to solve a problem. I like the challenge of it, and I wanted to solve this problem. I'm a compulsive problem solver. And this was kind of like the first time where I wasn't able to do that. And it was because I was dependent upon somebody else. Somebody else was a blocker to this. And I didn't have I just moved to a different country. I also didn't have such a big network. I wasn't so known. I was still fairly young. Even though I was a marketing director, I was still fairly young in my career back then. This was 10, 11 years ago. And, this was the first time that I was hit by an inability to achieve something that I wanted to, because I lacked an ability to do something, or I lacked an outside resources to do. And I lacked an outside resource to actually accomplish that. And I wasn't able to get it. And this kind of feeling really stayed with me throughout the rest of my career. I'm still in the middle of it, but it also helped. It also kind of led to, and we'll get to it, the next stage of my journey, to the next idea that I had, which we'll deal with in a different episode, and kind of the beginnings of which then led to me being able to build MediaSync, or what it is now. So I would say that this kind of block this kind of block kind of influenced um, the direction I take. And I always remember the fact that I wasn't able to build that product. And there are products out there that are similar to it or better than it by a long, like huge things that that I that came out afterwards. And had I been able to build this earlier, it would have been a great idea. But you never really know. But I do always remember the fact that I was blocked from being able to do this. Um, and I didn't have the thing that I needed to actually build it. Um, and because I was dependent upon somebody else. And that kind of would lead me to, like, I guess, what happened next, which I will deal with in kind of like the next episode. Cheers.